You may heard a lot about clean architecture. If you want to understand clean architecture in just one video, this is a correct video for you. For those who don't know me, I am Fuad Alavi. I am a senior software developer and this is my YouTube channel. In this YouTube channel, I usually create some videos about software development and more specifically .NET development. To understand clean architecture, you need to understand the architectures that we had before clean architecture. If you saw my previous videos, I really like to talk about the history of everything because by understanding the history behind each architecture or each design, you know how to use it because you will realize why it is created in the first place. Let's talk about the normal N-layer application. At the time that I started working as a software developer in 2008, N-layer application was a common thing. We had 3 layers of application in general. The first one was the presentation layer. The presentation layer was the layer which we created our user interface there. At the time, we used ASP.NET Web Form and gradually we migrated to MVC. Both Web Form, MVC, Razor Pages, they're just some applications for presentation layer. In presentation layer, we have just one responsibility: present something to the client. Yes, you heard it correct, just one responsibility. It may remind you of the single responsibility that we have in solid principles. It is correct because single responsibility is something that can be applied on project, on classes, even on methods. And projects that we have in each of these layers should have just one responsibility to serve. After that, we have this business logic layer. In the business logic layer, we have some business rules, we have some logics. It is the place that places everything here. And finally, we have this data access layer. In this data access layer, we are just communicating to our database. We can use Entity Framework, Dapper, ADO.NET, whatever you want. But we should not spoil this layer with anything else. And eventually, we have the database. The mindset that we had 15 years ago was to design the database first. And it is the reason that we call this mindset about using N-layer application data-centric, because we first start with designing the database, designing the data model, and based on the data model, we created the model that we had in the application. Let's see what do we have in details in N-layer application. We should start with database. We call this N-layer application data-centric because our mindset forces us to create a database first, design the database, create the tables, and then out of the tables, create the entities. For using these entities, getting and setting data from and to these entities, we create and we should create the repositories. And we should create iRepositories to prevent coupling to these repositories. We don't want to have concrete dependency in other layers to repositories. Then we should use iRepositories. And in most cases, we are using Entity Framework. Then we have DB context here in this layer. Then we have the business logic or BLL or biz layer. You can call it whatever you want. We have business logics. We have iBusiness, because we don't want to have dependency directly to this business. As I told you, each layer is going to use other layers. And here in this business, we are going to use repositories. In the business, we don't want to have concrete dependency to repositories. Then we use iRepository. And in the presentation layer, we are going to use the business layer. We don't want to have a concrete dependency between presentation and business layer. So we use this iBusiness. In business layer, we should cover application business logics and domain business logics. There is different types of logic and business rules that we have. As an example, imagine that we have an employee entity or employee domain model. This employee may have some rules for itself. As an example, the age of an employee shouldn't be less than 80, and the age for the same employee cannot be more than 67. Here in Netherlands, it is 67. I'm not sure about the other countries. We have some other rules related to the application itself. As an example, if we are going to calculate the salary, we should calculate the salary at the 22nd of each month. Then we have the business logic related to the whole application and business logic related to the domain. And eventually we have the presentation layer. Presentation layer is the startup project. What do I mean by a startup project? Imagine that we have three projects: presentation layer, business layer, and data access layer. The startup project is the project that gets started by the compiler. It is the initial point of the executing of the application. And the first thing in the startup project that we should call and we should run is the dependency injection. Because the first thing, not the first thing, but almost the first thing that gets executed in the startup application, in web applications, is to filling the services and instantiating the dependency injection engine or container. We have view models and obviously we have controllers as well. Okay, we talked about dependency injection. But for a second, let's assume that we are developers for the time that dependency injection haven't been introduced. The referencing between the projects should be like that. We have a controller. Controller will receive the request. And then this controller is going to call the business. And business is going to do something, run the business application logic. Then it is going to call the repositories. And in the repositories, it is going to read something from the database or store something inside the database. And repository is responsible to be in contact with the database via DB context or via pure ADO.net. Let me clean it. But the story is different when we have dependency injection, because we need to register all services that we have. In services, we should say when we have I repositories, instantiate something like repository. And when we have I business, instantiate an instance of business. Then not only we need to have direct dependency to business logic in the presentation, we need to reference the data access layer in the presentation layer as well. Okay, you know me, I don't like to register my services which are related to other layers in the presentation layer. It is the reason that I create some extension methods like that in each layer, and each layer is responsible for registering its own services into the dependency injection and into my services. It is an example of the persistence service registration. Persistence layer is something like the data access layer, but in the clean architecture, and it is going to add its own services to the application. We have a code dependency. As I told you, a code here is going to call something in another project. We are going to show it using this arrow. And we have framework dependency. Framework dependency is what I explained about dependency injection. These names, you cannot find them anywhere. I'm just naming them like that for this presentation. It is not a common name, but we have some other dependencies which you are not using any code of the other project in your project. As an example, here in the presentation layer, you are not calling anything from data access layer, but you need to have one reference from this project in the presentation layer because you want to register the dependencies and services of this layer. And we have another one here. Then in the architecture level, we need to think about not only the code dependencies, but also the framework dependencies. Almost in all videos that you see, they are drawing some arrows from one layer to another. What they are showing you is the code dependency, not the framework dependency, because eventually, because of this dependency injection, your startup application should almost have a reference to all your projects. Well, this is the basic implementation of the n-layer application or 3 layers application, but we can enhance this architecture by some changes. As an example, if we place the entities here as a cross-cutting concern project and reference from the data access layer to it and business layer to it, it is one enhancement. And another enhancement that we can have is to placing this iRepository interface or interfaces inside my business logic layer. Look at the point of the arrow. The arrow is pointing from business logic to the data access layer here and here. But if I place these I repositories in my business logic layer, we need to reverse the pointing. We need to put a reference of business logic layer inside the data access layer right now. You may say it is not a huge improvement. Yes, of course, it is not a huge improvement, but for the sake of the single of responsibility, I'm going to place almost all my contracts, all my interfaces in my business logic layer because it is related to the business and we need to have them in one single place. I am using the term entity for the models that I have. And here I'm using domain business logic. Domain and entities are two different things. We have entity, we have domain, we have rich domain model, and we have domain-driven design. Domain-driven design is something else, but it is really related to the rich domain entity that we have. Let's assume entities and domains are the same thing for the sake of simplicity. The next improvement that we can have in this architecture is placing this domain business logics in the entity layer, and just let's change the name to the domain. Oh, I forgot to mention that we can change the name of the data access layer to the persistence layer as well. And now we can change the name of this layer to application layer. And maybe we can split some parts of this application as well. Okay, let's just change the shape and place it like that. We still have three layers. We have API layer or presentation layer, which is the first layer and my startup project. We have application layer, we have domain layer, and we have persistence layer. It is still my three-layer application, but because the enhancement that we did, we can call it clean architecture. Really easy. Let's go to the next slide and explain it to you. We have domain and application. They are the two layers that we have. We are going to wrap them in another layer or another folder, physical folder or logical folder, and call it core. And this application is going to use domain, and it has a reference to domain in itself. We have persistent layer. We have another layer for logging. We have another layer for sending emails. We have some other layers for doing the things which are related to the infrastructure. We can wrap them in a logical or physical folder and call them infrastructure. The infrastructure layer projects have dependency to the application and core layer. And we have my API, which is the startup project, as the presentation layer. And you can see the dependency here. Then clean architecture is not a big deal. It is just a new way of presenting the N layer application. And do not forget the framework dependencies. This presentation layer, because it needs to register the services of the infrastructure layer, should have a reference to each of the projects that I have in the infrastructure layer. It should have another reference to the application or other projects that I have in the core layer as well. We usually use circles to show the clean architecture. I don't know why, but we like it. The first thing that we have is the domain. Domain is the heart of the clean architecture. The reason that we place domains in the center of the clean architecture is to remind you that the center of our design and architecture is not database anymore. The heart of our architecture should be our domain model. The reason that we use domain-driven design and clean architecture mostly together is this emphasis of having the domains at the heart of our application and the heart of our structure. And then we have the application layer. Application layer is a layer that we have our application business logics in it. In the domain layer, we have the domain business logics and entities. And then we have another layer, another outer layer for infrastructure. In the infrastructure layer, we can have persistence layer, we can have logger, we can have email sender, and we can have a lot of infrastructure related things. And then we have the presentation layer, which is my API. And the dependencies is like that. The framework dependency API is going to reference application. and API is going to reference the infrastructure. Forget about the framework dependencies for a second. We have some rules. We have some concrete rules here in the clean architecture. In clean architecture, outer layers can have dependency to inner layers, not vice versa. And when I'm talking about this rule, it just applies to the code dependencies, not to the framework dependencies. There is a misconception about the dependencies when you are talking about the architectures, because eventually you will realize that another layer, for example, API, is going to have a reference to persistent, logger, and email sender. Do not confuse these two types of dependencies that we have. And the code dependencies, we have a dependency to the application in infrastructure and API, and in infrastructure we need to have access to domains as well. And we call domain and application layer core layer because we like to generate some names for the things that we already have and already used for more than 2 decades. I don't know why we are doing that. This is the shape that you can see in the books about the entities. Entities are the heart of this design. And after that, we have the use cases. Use cases are something like the application that I showed you in the previous slide. Use cases and entities together create the core layer for me. As you can see here, we have domain or entities. We have application or use cases. These are two different terminology that you may hear when you are talking about clean architecture with your colleagues or with some other developers. The next layer is gateway, presenter, and controller, because we need to expose the functionality that we wrapped here to the world using controller or presenters. And we need to have some adapters to communicate with our infrastructures as well. Then the infrastructure layer and API layer are this blue and green layer that I have here. As you can see, enterprise business rules are going to be defined here. As I told you, we have rich domain model, and it is better to use rich domain model in the clean architecture. And the application business rules should be implemented here in the use cases or in the application. Okay, now that you know what is a clean architecture, now that you understand it once forever, it is time to start the playlist that I created for you. Every week, I'm going to upload 2 videos about clean architecture. We are going to create an application together from beginning to the end. I'm going to cover a lot of things in this series of videos, like command query pattern, like mediator, like API, like Blazor, like entity framework, like, you name it. Then do not miss my videos. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. And by pressing the bell and hitting the bell, you will get notified when I upload a new video. Enjoy your life as a developer and do not miss the rest of the videos of this series.